Controversies with the Pharisees. Flash of visions. The sun was rising over Jerusalem, its golden rays caressing the ancient stones of the temple. The city was slowly awakening, but already a palpable tension hung in the air. Jesus of Nazareth, the itinerant preacher whose fame was ever growing, was back in town. And with him, inevitably, came the controversies. In the narrow alleys of the city, one could hear the excited whispers of the crowd. "Have you heard? He's back. What will he do this time?" Pharisees won't be pleased. The Pharisees. This respected group of religious leaders, zealous guardians of the law and Jewish tradition. They watched with growing concern the increasing influence of this Jesus. Who was he to question their teachings? To attract such crowds? To claim to speak with the authority of God himself? Let's imagine the scene. Jesus is sitting in the temple courtyard, surrounded by an attentive crowd. His disciples are there, Peter, James, John, and the others, forming a protective circle around their master. And then, cutting through the crowd, here come the Pharisees, their impeccable robes contrasting with the dusty clothes of the pilgrims. Their faces are tense, their eyes scrutinizing. They've heard about Jesus' teachings, his alleged miracles, the way he freely interprets the law. They've come to confront him, to trap him if possible. One of them steps forward, his voice charged with challenge. "Teacher," says, hint of irony in his voice, "why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." Murmur runs through the crowd. Washing hands before eating wasn't just a matter of hygiene for the Jews of the time. It was a religious ritual, a way of symbolically purifying oneself before receiving food, considered a gift from God. All eyes turn to Jesus. How will he respond? Will he dodge the question? Apologize? But Jesus, his gaze calm and assured, answers with a question. "And why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition?" The crowd holds its breath. Jesus has just directly accused the Pharisees of violating God's law. He continues, quoting the prophet Isaiah, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." The Pharisees are stunned. Jesus isn't just defending himself. He's directly attacking them. He's questioning not only their interpretation of the law, but their very sincerity in their devotion to God. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He turns to the crowd and declares, "Listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them." These words resound like a clap of thunder. Jesus has just questioned centuries of Jewish tradition concerning ritual purity. For the Pharisees, purity was a matter of external actions, washing hands, avoiding certain foods, observing the Sabbath. But Jesus shifts the debate to a matter of the heart. He later explains to his disciples, "But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander." This confrontation marks the beginning of a series of controversies that will pit Jesus against the Pharisees throughout his ministry. Each of these controversies will reveal a different aspect of the fundamental conflict between Jesus' vision and that of the religious leaders of his time. A few days later, as Jesus and his disciples were going through the grain fields on the Sabbath, the disciples, being hungry, began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. The Pharisees, always on the lookout, seized the opportunity. "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." The Sabbath, a sacred day of rest for Jews, was surrounded by a multitude of strict rules. Picking heads of grain could be considered a form of work, thus a violation of the Sabbath. But Jesus responded by citing the example of David, who had eaten the consecrated bread in the temple when he was hungry, although it was normally forbidden. Concluded with these provocative words, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." This statement was revolutionary. Jesus was not only asserting his authority over the interpretation of the law, but also his divinity by proclaiming himself Lord of the Sabbath. The tension escalated even further when, on a Sabbath, Jesus healed a man with a shriveled hand in a synagogue. The Pharisees, looking for a reason to accuse him, asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" Jesus responded with a question. If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then, openly defying the Pharisees, he healed the man in front of everyone. The Gospel tells us that the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. These controversies around the Sabbath perfectly illustrate the conflict between the Pharisees' literal and legalistic interpretation of the law and Jesus' approach, which emphasized the intention behind the law and compassion. Another subject of controversy was Jesus' associations. The Pharisees were scandalized to see him eating with tax collectors and sinners, people considered impure according to the law. During a meal at Matthew's house, a tax collector, who had become a disciple of Jesus, the Pharisees asked the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus replied, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." This response from Jesus was a scathing criticism of the Pharisees' attitude, who considered themselves righteous and despised those they judged as sinners. Jesus reversed this logic, affirming that it was precisely these sinners who most needed his message. One day, John's disciples came to ask Jesus, "How is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" Fasting was an important practice in Judaism, considered a sign of piety and repentance. Jesus answered with a series of metaphors. "How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? A time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and they will fast." Continued, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. The patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." Through these metaphors, Jesus suggested that his teaching was radically new and could not be contained in the old religious forms. He was calling for a new understanding of the relationship with God, based not on external practices, but on an inner transformation. One day, as Jesus was teaching in the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him and asked, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" It was a trap question. Jesus claimed divine authority. They could accuse him of blasphemy. If he denied having special authority, they could discredit his teaching. But Jesus, with his characteristic wisdom, responded with another question. "I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things." John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or of human origin? This response put the religious leaders in a quandary. If they said from heaven, Jesus would ask them why they didn't believe John. They said of human origin, they feared the crowd's reaction because they considered John a prophet. Unable to answer, they said, "We don't know." Jesus then concluded, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." This confrontation illustrates Jesus' wisdom in the face of his adversaries' traps, but also the depth, the conflict that opposed him to the religious authorities of his time. A major point of friction between Jesus and the Pharisees concerned the place of human traditions in relation to divine law. The Pharisees had developed over the centuries a complex set of rules and interpretations of the law, known as the traditions of the elders. Jesus often criticized the way these traditions were sometimes used to circumvent the spirit of the law. In a particularly striking episode, he accused the Pharisees of using a tradition called Corban to escape their duty to honor their parents. Corban was a vow by which a person dedicated their goods to God. Some used this vow to declare that their resources were consecrated to God, thus exempting them from the obligation to help their parents in need. Jesus denounced this practice. "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and 'Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death.' But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is Corban, that is, devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus, you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. This criticism highlighted a fundamental problem: how human traditions could sometimes be used to circumvent the original intention of divine law. One of Jesus' harshest criticisms of the Pharisees concerned their hypocrisy. In a passionate discourse reported in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus addresses the scribes and Pharisees directly. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." These harsh words aim to denounce the gap between the Pharisees' outward appearance of piety and the reality of their hearts. Jesus accused them of emphasizing rituals and external rules while neglecting the deeper values of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He illustrated this point with a striking parable, that of the Pharisee and the tax collector. In this story, a Pharisee and a tax collector, considered a notorious sinner, go up to the temple to pray. Pharisee stands by himself and prays, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get." The tax collector, on the other hand, stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Jesus concluded, "I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." This parable perfectly illustrates Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees' attitude. He reproached them for focusing on their own apparent righteousness rather than on their need, God's grace. As Jesus' ministry progressed, tensions with the Pharisees continued to intensify. The Pharisees, feeling threatened by Jesus' growing influence and scandalized by his teachings, began to plot against him. The Gospel of Mark reports that after Jesus had healed a man on the Sabbath, the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. This alliance between the Pharisees and the Herodians, supporters of Herod, was particularly significant. Normally, these two groups were politically and religiously opposed. Their willingness to unite against Jesus shows how much they perceived him as a threat to the established order. The Pharisees began to follow Jesus closely, seeking to trap him in his words. They asked him difficult questions on controversial subjects, hoping to catch him in contradiction with the law of Moses, or make him appear as a political agitator in the eyes of the Roman authorities. To fully understand these controversies, we must place them in their historical context. First-century Judea was a society in crisis under Roman occupation, desperately seeking to preserve its cultural and religious identity. Pharisees, contrary to the often caricatural image given of them, were not simply rigid hypocrites. They were the heirs of a long tradition of cultural and spiritual resistance. Their insistence on scrupulous observance of the law was a way of maintaining Jewish identity in the face of the omnipresent Hellenistic influence. Moreover, the Pharisees had played a crucial role in the democratization of Jewish religion. Unlike the aristocratic Sadducees, they believed that holiness was accessible to all, not just priests. Their teaching had allowed Judaism to survive the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Jesus, while criticizing certain aspects of their teaching, actually shared many commonalities with the Pharisees. Like them, he believed in the resurrection, in the importance of prayer and study of the Scriptures, and in the accessibility of God for all. The controversies between Jesus and the Pharisees, as reported in the Gospels, offer us a fascinating glimpse into the theological and ethical debates of the time. But beyond their historical context, these confrontations raise questions that remain relevant today. They invite us to reflect on the nature of true spirituality. Is it a matter of outward observance or inner transformation? How do we find the balance between respect for tradition and openness to new revelations? These controversies also remind us of the dangers of spiritual pride and religious hypocrisy. They warn us against the temptation to judge others while neglecting our own spiritual growth. Finally, Jesus' teachings call us to a religion of the heart. Faith that manifests itself not simply through rituals or rules, through love, compassion, and justice. As the sun sets over Jerusalem, as the echoes of debates fade in the city's alleys, the question remains, as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. How do we live an authentic faith that honors tradition while remaining open to new revelations? How can we be faithful to our convictions while remaining compassionate towards those who think differently? These questions, raised by the controversies between Jesus and the Pharisees, continue to challenge us and call us to constant reflection on our own spiritual and ethical journey.